Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we're going to look at some of the challenges that face cities as they continue to grow and change. And we're going to start with some history that still creates challenges in the present. Redlining was a practice by which financial institutions, such as a bank, refused to offer home loans to high-risk neighborhoods on the basis of racial or ethnic makeup. Banks and other lending institutions considered certain parts of cities as poor investments and literally outlined them in red. And they refused to offer loans to these neighborhoods, which were predominantly black, low-income, female-run households, or working-class families. This prevented these marginalized groups from moving into more desirable neighborhoods. And because they couldn't get loans to purchase or improve their homes, many properties in redlined areas fell into disrepair or were abandoned. And blockbusting further segregated cities. Blockbusting was a practice in which realtors persuaded white homeowners in a neighborhood to sell their homes by convincing them that the neighborhood was declining due to black families moving in. Real estate agents would play on homeowners' prejudices. They would convince white property owners to sell their homes at below market prices, and then turn around and sell that same house at a much higher price to a black family that was trying to get into a better neighborhood. This led to a dramatic shift in the racial makeup of neighborhoods, as white families left for the suburbs, a process known as white flight. And while blockbusting was outlawed in the late 1960s, many communities are still economically and racially segregated. Both redlining and blockbusting impacted the affordability of housing. That is, the percentage of income a homeowner can spend on rent or a mortgage. In many cities, there is a lack of affordable housing units, as increasing urban populations compete for a limited stock of affordable units. Some local governments have attempted to address this through rent subsidies, tax credits, or reduced property taxes, and the federal government provides a housing choice voucher program for very low-income families. But affordability of housing remains an issue. And since many middle and high-income families moved out to the suburbs, their tax revenue went with them. So many municipal governments have struggled to provide adequate services to urban residents. Services like well-funded public schools, regular sanitation services, and adequate police and fire protection are all funded based on tax revenue. And when educational and economic opportunities are scarce and police funding is limited, crime can become an issue. Disadvantaged, segregated communities are disproportionately affected by high rates of violent crime. But over the last 2 decades, the United States has seen a significant decline in rates of violent crime. Furthermore, a study conducted from 1980 to 2008 found that only 3% of the geographic area in Boston accounted for more than half of all gun violence incidents. So by using tools like GIS, law enforcement agencies may be able to identify these so-called hotspots for focused policing efforts. Urban residents also have to contend with issues of environmental injustice. Things like garbage dumps and sewage treatment plants are more likely to be located in a poor neighborhood than a wealthy one. Activists have pointed that communities of color or the poor are more likely exposed to environmental hazards and are often excluded from decision making. One example is Cancer Alley, a region with more than 100 industrial plants that is predominantly black and low income. Another is the situation in Flint, Michigan, as the community suffered from contaminated drinking water. In areas that lack basic services, suffer from higher rates of crime, and are at risk from environmental injustice, can develop into disamenity zones. These areas lack basic services like fresh water, electricity, and adequate safety measures. One such example of disamenity zones are the favelas of Brazil. The favelas are characterized by informal housing, lack of basic city services, and rampant crime. In fact, many of the favelas are controlled by gangs or drug lords. And these disamenity zones are expanding in population density and becoming more prevalent. And added to all of this is that as cities have grown in size, more layers of government need to coordinate in order to provide services, policing, and manage policy. So there's often confusion regarding funding and who is going to provide the services. So to tie all of this together, many of the challenges that cities face are interconnected. Housing discrimination promotes economic and racial segregation, which also contributes to the declining tax base of inner cities. Many inner city residents are elderly or low income, so they have a greater need for social services, which many cities struggle to provide due to declining revenue. This can contribute to rising crime and environmental injustice, which can perpetuate a cycle of poverty. And in many of the biggest cities in the developing world, the combination of large numbers of migrants and high unemployment lead to the development of squatter settlements. A squatter settlement is an informal housing area beset with overcrowding and poverty that features inadequate housing, often made of wood or metal sheeting. These new migrants are unable to find affordable housing within the city, so they must make their own structures from whatever materials they can find on the outskirts. These settlements go by a variety of different names like favelas, shantytowns, or simply slums, but they generally have certain characteristics in common. They're usually found on the periphery of the city, made of old signs, pieces of discarded wood, corrugated metal, or pieces of plastic or cardboard. The residents of squatter settlements are the poorest urban dwellers, often employed informally, and the squatter settlements lack even the most basic services, like fresh water, sanitation, or electricity. One of the key issues for residents of squatter settlements is the lack of land tenure. Land tenure is the legal right associated with owning land. When you have land tenure, you can decide who uses the land, for how long, and under what conditions. So let's look at some examples of squatter settlements and the issue of land tenure. Over 1 billion people in the world live in slums, and some scholars predict that it will grow to 2 billion people in the next half century. In Manila, the capital of the Philippines, it's estimated that nearly half of the city's 19 million inhabitants live in slum conditions. In Jakarta, Indonesia, the squatter settlements are on low-lying areas that are prone to flooding. In Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, Brazil, the favelas are often built on steep hillsides that can suffer from landslides during the rainy season. Mokoko, a squatter settlement in Lagos, Nigeria, is the world's biggest floating informal settlement, with a population that is estimated between 40,000 and 300,000. But in 2012, government officials ordered the settlement disbanded. Demolition workers came through with machetes and set fire to the settlement, leaving tens of thousands of people homeless. And since many squatters lack legal ownership of the land, they lack land tenure, they're especially vulnerable when disaster strikes. But some settlements are becoming increasingly elaborate and permanent. As settlements become more permanent, services are extended to the slums, and residents may have the opportunity to gain legal rights to the land that they have occupied. So, what have some communities done in response to these challenges? Well, inclusionary zoning is a movement that attempts to redress the issues of redlining, blockbusting, and the lack of affordable housing. It began in the 1970s by offering incentives to developers to reserve a specific share of new housing units for people with low to moderate incomes. Its stated aim is to promote economic, racial, and cultural integration in urban neighborhoods by reducing segregation. One of its benefits is that inclusionary housing does not typically need as much government financial support through subsidies because developers are the ones reserving the units, rather than the government providing money to poorer residents. But critics have argued that it could limit the housing supply, thereby raising the cost of housing for a larger segment of the population, since the consumers that pay the market rate are the ones being asked to subsidize the lower cost housing. But inclusionary housing is used in half of all US states, including almost 900 different cities. And a recent study found that inclusionary zoning policies did not lead to an overall decline in housing production or higher housing prices. Another response to the availability of services, environmental injustice, and the rise of disamenity zones has been to promote local food movements. There has been a recent increase in the amount of urban agriculture globally. This can increase the amount of healthy fruits and vegetables to low-income communities, helping to address the issue of food deserts that we discussed back in our agriculture unit. The development of green belts, specifically in Canadian cities, has allowed people to harvest food from public lands and distribute it to lower-income communities. In other North American areas, especially those left deindustrialized, where brownfields have needed redevelopment, many vacant lots have been turned into community vegetable gardens. While it should be noted that often locally sourced food is more expensive, it does provide more options for low-income urban residents to obtain nutritious food while also offering opportunities to promote sustainability, while also providing additional economic opportunities for residents. And as far as government fragmentation, some cities have utilized regional planning commissions to work together, but others have taken a less popular approach. By consolidating services and removing layers of hierarchy, larger entities like a county or state may provide the services rather than a local municipality. And the idea of giving up local control hasn't been very popular with government officials or with voters, but it has led to a decline in fragmented areas that can make it more difficult to provide basic necessities to low-income urban residents. One final response to the decline of urban areas is urban renewal and gentrification. Urban renewal is the large-scale redevelopment of an older downtown or inner-city area, and it was especially prominent throughout the United States in the 1950s and 60s. So as deindustrialization occurred, lots of old factory districts and brownfields were abandoned. State and local governments would receive massive federal grants to demolish these old industrial areas and declining neighborhoods and build new housing and infrastructure in its place. For example, Baltimore's Inner Harbor was a shipping and warehousing district that was completely renovated. But urban renewal throughout the country displaced more than 1 million people from their homes. And most of the areas that were demolished were lower income and predominantly African American. More recently, though, private individuals and companies have led the redevelopment of declining urban areas. This is part of a process called gentrification, which is the displacement of lower income residents by higher income residents as an area or neighborhood improves and the social character changes. Many homebuyers and commercial investors realized that buildings that were abandoned or declining in the city were much more affordable. So many upper middle class people bought up the deteriorated buildings in city centers and renovated them. And some buildings were changed into housing, like old warehouses that were renovated into apartments. Of course, commercial gentrification typically followed residential gentrification. So new businesses began to open, which introduced new patterns of consumption into the inner city. And governments have typically gotten on board with this, encouraging commercial and residential redevelopment in the downtown area. A local example for us is the redevelopment and gentrification of downtown Las Vegas and Fremont Street. East Fremont has Container Park, that you can see here, and the entire area has become more walkable and attractive to younger people. But here's the tricky part. We have to recognize that gentrification specifically and urban renewal more broadly have positives and negatives. Which side of the situation speaks more to you as an individual? Well, that's up for you to decide. But let's examine the common positives and negatives associated with urban renewal and gentrification. On the positive side, gentrification revitalizes an economically downtrodden part of the city and improves the buildings and housing stock. This attracts new people like young married couples to live closer to their jobs and increases the city's tax base. The improvements lead to higher property values, which also adds to the municipal coffers and allows for infrastructure upgrades like new sidewalks and parks, repaved roads, and fiber optic internet installation. Many individuals without kids, both older and younger, are drawn to the culture and character of cities and enjoy being within walking distance of entertainment and museums and restaurants and shopping. And finally, on the positive side, gentrification can restore an area's visual appeal, replacing abandoned and boarded up buildings with new tenants and businesses. But on the flip side, there are many negatives associated with gentrification as well. As property values go up, so do the rents, meaning that many existing urban residents, in particular lower income residents, are displaced. Some will find new places of residence, but it might be much farther from their work, meaning longer commutes or having to find a new job. But many others are left homeless. And locally owned businesses may not be able to compete with multinational chains that move in, causing them to relocate or close. And gentrification frequently contributes to social tensions, as the people moving in and those being forced out are often from different racial or ethnic groups. And gentrified neighborhoods usually stand in stark contrast from the surrounding areas, where investment has not taken place, further contributing to an uneven distribution of wealth within cities. Finally, some have complained that gentrification leads to a decline in the unique character of a community, leading to gentrified neighborhoods looking like many other cookie-cutter areas, a concept called placelessness. And we are going to continue this conversation when we come back to class. Have a good night, everyone.